Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. I'm so glad for you all who have joined us in the room, and thank you to you all who are joining us online. My name is Emily Esau. I'm the program coordinator of visual communication here at the Paducah School of Art and Design, which is part of West Kentucky Community and Technical College. We're really excited to have you guys here. We're especially excited to have Les here. Les has been a dear friend for a short amount of time, but a very, very wonderful amount of time. We're very happy to have him here. But he's going to be talking to us tonight about comics and culture. He's got a lot of things on his plate. He has a huge just history in this world, and we're really excited to hear from him tonight. We also will have some other things to share with you near the end about some things that he has coming up that we will be hosting here at the college. So I'm really excited to share those with you. But you didn't come here or are watching online. You didn't do this to hear me. You wanted to hear him. So give it up for Les Garner. Yay! Take it away.
All right. So, yeah, let's get into this. I guess where to start with, it's kind of funny because origin story. So I'm going to get into a little bit about kind of my origins and the whole thing with comics, and then that dovetails into some thoughts about comics and their importance in culture and all that sort of thing. So we'll get there. I guess I should start off by just kind of getting into my origin story a bit. My name's Les Garner, obviously, and I come from Eastern Kentucky, the the bleeding, impoverished bowels of Eastern Kentucky, if you will. And so I often toss this out. I did not have indoor plumbing until I was 11 years old. So when I say Eastern Kentucky, I'm talking about Eastern, almost West Virginia, coal country, Kentucky. So there's some interesting things that I always tie to that, though, and how that plays into not only my love of comics and art, like all kinds of art and music and storytelling and all those things, but it also is just a huge driving part of where I've been and where I'm going, including this bottle of water coming my way. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Yay. That's Kelly, for those who don't know, and she's awesome and short, and I pick on her for it. That's always fun. So, yeah, I come from Eastern Kentucky, and it's funny because I'm up here speaking publicly, so my accent kind of dies off, and that kind of figures into the story a bit because when I was 19, I moved out of Eastern Kentucky. A series of kind of happenstances that I turned into opportunities allowed me to move from Eastern Kentucky to a place called New Milford, Connecticut, just outside of New York. And I went there and would work, good Lord, worked like 4 days a week, about 12 hours a day in construction, would go home at night, pound away on my portfolio, and then on Fridays I would hop a train into Manhattan and take my portfolio and shop it around, looking for work with editors, comic book editors, anybody that had any kind of artwork they needed done. I was going to hunt them down and show them what I got and see if I could get work out of it. Of course, that was 1993, so I've been doing this almost 30 years now, and in 1993 that was really necessary to go be there in the thick of it like that. I would pitch my work and hammer away at editors and shows and all that kind of stuff until offices closed or shows shut down, which typically on a Friday was going to be around 5 or 6 p.m. And then I would go down to Central Park with a backpack full of art supplies and start hustling. I'd just go up to people and, hey, sketches, it was in New York, so it was like, $15, $20. This is back in 93. And I would just sketch people, do sketches and sell sketches to tourists in Central Park all night. when I get tired, I would grab a nap on a bench and wake up and get back to it. So I would do that from Friday evening all the way till Sunday morning, and then hop a train and sleep on the train back to Connecticut, and then construction through the week, hammer art from Friday all the way to Sunday morning, rinse, repeat. I did that for quite a few months until I started to get a little bit of work. I think my first real small jobs, my first real commercial piece of work was actually drawing a coloring book of the Energizer Bunny. So yeah, it's totally stupid, but I learned a lot from that. So how I got interested in doing art really was kind of a thing from being a little kid growing up in a holler. Yes, it's Eastern Kentucky. It's not a hollow. It is a holler. Growing up in a holler with no indoor plumbing and I think 3 electrical outlets in the entire house. But when I was 3, Star Wars came out. And my dad would haul gravel and water to people in the area. And because of that, he knew a lot of people. And he knew the folks who owned the, shout out to Judy Drive-In. It's still going to this day. Actually, before we moved here, my significant other here, she lived with me in Eastern Kentucky for the last few years, and we would go to Judy Drive-In. It was just always a big thing for me. But he knew the folks who owned the drive-in and the couple of different theaters in the area. And when Star Wars came out, he would leave me with them during the day. And I saw Star Wars hundreds of times, literally hundreds of times in its first run in the theaters. I was a little kid who would bring a couple of Star Wars toys and a book, like a Star Wars movie book, and whatever kind of paper I had or anything that I had to draw on. And I would just sit there and watch Star Wars and draw and trace things from this book. So, comic books were the other key factor besides the influence of Star Wars. Was I had an older brother who had a Foot Locker full of battered old comic books from the 60s and 70s, and his stuff, and steal myself 3 or 4 of those and literally take them with me when I went to go milk cows. And I would milk cows with a comic book sitting on my knee. No joke. I think I was probably 5, 6 years old, milking cows and looking at comic books. And there's a thing that stuck with me that, like, I don't know why this clicked in my head. But you know how when you're a little kid, and little kids, they all play pretend. It's an important part of development. And I guess nowadays kids probably, like they play as characters from games they like, because games take over everything. When I was a kid, we played pretend as characters from our favorite comic books and cartoons, or at least the other kids did. I didn't. The other kids are like, "Oh, I'm Batman, I'm Superman, I'm Spider-Man." And I'd be like, I'm Denny O'Neil. I'm Neil Adams. I'm Jack Kirby. And it was a thing. I was like, these characters are all made up, but these names on this page that says who drew it, says who wrote it, those aren't made up. Those are real people, and those are the people who made. I'm like. The little kids are like, who's stronger, Thor or Hulk? I'm like, does it matter? They were made by one of these guys. That's who's strongest, is the guy who made them. I was like, y'all can be all of those. I want to be these guys. And it was like an obsessive thing as a kid. I used to trace the artwork of Jack Kirby and Neil Adams and Steve Ditko and all these artists from comics. I did not have, we were poor enough that I didn't have art supplies. Art supplies were considered a luxury. So what I would draw on, I would sneak into Granny's kitchen and I would get into her wax paper that she used for baking. And if you've ever played around with wax paper, you know that if you fold it, it gets little white lines and stuff in it. Well, if you scratch it, that wax leaves a white line. So I had, it was like an old nail from something, And I would take that wax paper and lay it down on things and use that nail to scratch white lines into that. And it's wax paper, so you can't see through it perfectly, right? But you could make out things through it. So as a little kid, I would look at it and go, okay, that's kind of what that looks like coming through here. And I would trace it with a nail in wax. And I would save those. So my Star Wars movie book and my comic books all had these like sheets, torn out sheets of wax paper sticking between the pages where I had traced the artwork or traced the photos with a nail. So, you know, and it's funny because, you know, like it didn't dawn on me until I was in my mid-teens, really, how bizarre that was. Because for me, you know, it's like when a thing is all you know, then you don't know there's anything else. So that is normal. So that was normal for me. It's totally normal. It was, okay, well, yeah, this makes sense. I'll just do this. And something about it, I feel like, gave me an intimacy with comics, with art, that just stuck. And as I got older, my dad really noticed this. He noticed, you know, it's like as I got a little bit older, I didn't need to trace anymore. You know, it was like I'd kind of trained my hand to do this. And since it was wax paper and I couldn't see super clearly, you know, I had trained my hand, like I had a little bit of a guide, I had a little bit of a help, but my brain had to do the work and my hand had to translate it. And it was like that instantiated this ability to take what was in my head and get it onto a page. And my dad saw that, and he was an extremely intelligent old guy for a guy who never graduated high school. Older man, he was born in 1919. But he absolutely encouraged me with art, art and music. He was, and this kind of gets into the culture of Eastern Kentucky a little bit. He was, you know, a man of Eastern Kentucky. He was born. My father was literally born on a table in a coal camp in southeast Kentucky. Actually, the place he was born was about 2 miles from a place called Butcher Holler. That was the birthplace of the country music legend Loretta Lynn. So, yeah, it was really wild growing up with somebody that old. But again, there's so many things that I didn't realize until I was older. But if you look around at things about Eastern Kentucky, you're going to see, like this place, Paducah, has, you know, the quilting museum, right? That's an art, and that's an art that is still practiced throughout Eastern Kentucky. I know plenty of old ladies in Eastern Kentucky who are all about making them quilts. There's other things that are inherently part of, I should say Kentucky writ large, because I am on the other side of the state now. On the western end, but you know, anybody who spends a lot of time in Kentucky, especially with Kentuckians, you know, people have heard me say this for a while, that there's Eastern Kentucky and there's Western Kentucky. I kind of grew up like there was Eastern Kentucky and Western Kentucky, and there's a whole funny thing that goes with that. But Eastern Kentucky is very much its own thing in a lot of ways, and part of that is the fact that, you know, we're in the hills, and a lot of us live in treacherous, pretty wild places to be. Some of them are places that are hard to get into and hard to get out of. And when that's the case, you get in there, you tend to stay put. You stay put, you get bored. And when people get bored, and you've got generations and generations of people who are used to living with very little, living in tough places, doing hard things, well, they figure out ways to entertain themselves. And so that's where this culture of storytelling comes from, out of Eastern Kentucky. It's probably how I learned to talk so damn much, pardon me. You know, we have this deep culture of storytelling. If you catch old timers, I encourage people, I'm like, look for those old folks from Eastern Kentucky. Find yourself the most illiterate old, cantankerous looking folks from Eastern Kentucky. I just ask them to tell you a story. You'll be there all day. And you'll probably be entertained, because the experience of life in a place like that is hard. But there's a big upside to that, is that hard experiences make good stories. So my father grew up hard, real hard. I mean, coal camps, the whole thing. I didn't grow up anywhere near as hard as he did, even though I didn't have indoor plumbing until I was 11, okay? But this culture of storytelling, and then the culture of music, the music of Appalachia reaches out so far beyond the hills, so far beyond. And there's become kind of a kitsch quaintness to it in, I feel like, the last 20, 30 years. And I feel like a lot of folks, it's great. They're welcome to enjoy it, but to understand it is a different thing. And so for me, as a kid, I played guitar. I learned to play guitar, learned to sing in church, Used to walk a couple miles down the road to the church that was never locked up, and I could go in there and bang around and figure out how to play piano. And it was very strange, because it wasn't strange then, but now I'm like, oh yeah, I learned how to play piano as a kid. And people are like, how'd you do that? And I'm like, well, the church was open. I just walked 2 miles down the road. I would walk 2 miles to go hang out in a church by myself as a little kid and just bang around on it until I started to figure it out, But that was life. Out of all that, between the church and my father and his stories and the storytelling, they have gatherings out there of people who get together and just trade stories. Like, people will sit around and they'll listen to somebody tell a story, then it's somebody else's turn. My father had a little country store, and a lot of times in the evening, that's what it would turn into on its own, was these old guys sitting around telling stories. So I grew up with this love of storytelling, transmitting that information from the folks who came before me to the folks who were going to come after me was just magical. That person is finite, but the fact that they can transmit the information of their experience to me, and I could transmit that to others, was transcendent. I put those things together with comics, because as a kid, comics, they're exciting. They're bright. There's action. There's all this stuff that grabs your attention. So that just was a natural fit. And the obsession with the art and working on all that stuff, it just channeled all these things that at the time I had no idea, but they were actually deeply embedded in the culture around me. So as I was growing up, my father would, he would notice that. He would notice my propensity for art, for music, things like that. And he would encourage it. He would encourage it all the time. He actually pushed his encouragement at times to a point I think a lot of folks wouldn't understand, but I tell this often, so I'm going to tell it now. I can remember being 11, 12 years old, and he's outside working on a car, and I'm like, hey, Dad, what are you doing? You show me what you're doing. I want to help you. I want to do that. And he'd say, no, I don't want you touching these old things. I don't want you being a grease monkey. I don't want you doing this. He'd say, get back in that house, and you either work on reading, or you work on your drawing, or you work on your guitar, because one of those things is going to take you out of these hills one day. And it did. It absolutely did. So that's kind of the Eastern Kentucky chapter of the story, and gets into, why. I can go on for hours like that, so I won't. But it gets into why this stuff is so you would not have me without these things. They're just that much a part of me. My personality, my being is intrinsically tied to both the medium of comics and the culture and background of coming from Eastern Kentucky. And so that in a very real way, I had no choice. Those were always going to get slammed together, no matter what. That was going to happen. There's just no avoiding it. So anyway, I ended up moving to Connecticut and pushing that stuff. Eventually got some work. And one of the interesting things that I found when I was there that my father tried to prepare me for, he died when I was 17, but he had prepared me. He tried to prepare me for this. When I left, my voice sounded a whole lot more like that. I double syllabled some words and took some words and cut them down from 3 syllables down to 1, and had, a cadence to my voice that if I break into that cadence now, my own kids can't understand it. And when I went north, and I was polite, I was mannerly, it's what I was taught to do. But people would say, "Where are you from?" Or the one that I knew was going to be followed by ridicule was, "You sound like you're from down south." And not having experienced it the first few times I'm there, I'm like, "Yes, sir, I come from Eastern Kentucky." And the reply would be, "Wow, you have shoes." And they thought they were funny. They had no idea the ridicule and the pain of that. And it chokes me up even now when I think about it. And I encountered that when I tried to get work, if I sounded like I was from where I was from. Get laughed out of the office. Get laughed at, made fun of. They wouldn't even look at your work. So I learned how to change it. I learned how to hide it. I learned how to put a veneer over all these things. And so I got to take the Eastern Kentucky in me. I had to learn to take it and set it aside. I learned to become Connecticut. I learned to become New York and to fit in and to find ways to get that work. And I swore to myself that one day, I wouldn't hide it anymore. One day I'd be able to let it out. And it became a habit to hide it over the years. And I think when I had kids, is when it struck me, I've been hiding myself. And I stopped hiding it. And it was great. It's like the most wonderful feeling to not have to do that anymore. And so now, like, friends in the comic book industry who I've worked with for 15, 20 years now, they know sometimes I'm going to drop an Eastern Kentucky colloquialism. Sometimes I'm going to look at a proof of a book and go, "Man, that done gone all gim-gum on that page. They need to get the registration straightened up." And they're going to look, and I'm going to be like, "Yeah, I said that." That's the thing. So that dovetails into actually why I'm here. See, some months ago, I had this opportunity to come to Paducah to sign a bunch of books that I'd done. And it was part of a benefit that Miss Emily here and other folks, that's another thing you'll find, we'll say Miss in front of a lot of stuff, Miss and Mr., and like sometimes that comes popping back out of me because that's what Dad taught me. So Miss Emily and some of the folks here had invited me and a couple other creators to come in and do some things, and I was asked about goals, and looking back on being a kid out there, I wasn't that unique. I really wasn't, and I know people now who grew up the same way I did the same things, walked to a church, played piano in that church, played a guitar. They read the comic books. We traded comic books. They drew stuff in similar strange ways that I did, and we shared that stuff. I just happened to find myself a piece of good fortune along the way that I had the awareness to jump on I found a ticket out to go out into the world and do something with it. And it has always struck me how awful that was. That I had to leave and abandon my culture. I had to abandon my family. I had to abandon my home just to go find those opportunities. And so this thought came to me in my 20s, and I shared this when I was here for the signing and for some things. This thought started coming to me in my 20s, late 20s, after I had kind of gotten on my feet and was starting to make it with this. I'm like, man, there's so many things that people teach and they say and they do, and I've run into all these people who've gone to this school or gone to that school or learned this or say they've got that or they've got, X, Y, or Z after their name. But is that really how it has to be? And people from back home aren't going to get that. They don't get that. People back home don't go to school. Hell, half of them drop out. They don't go to college. They don't get this alphabet soup after their name. They don't get people telling them that they are capable of going out there and creating something that matters. What they get is people asking them where their shoes are. And it became this thought that just kept turning over in my head. It's like, someday I will go home. Someday I will go home. And I will do everything in my power to help teach other people coming out of that place that you can. Okay, so you don't have the money to go to college. I don't care. Can you read books? This is early days of the internet when that stuff wasn't that available. Actually, I was pre-internet at first, and for me back then, it was go to a library. Go to a library, look the stuff up. There was nothing standing in the way of me going into a place and educating myself. Absolutely nothing to stop me from reading a book. That's why my father told me, get in the house and read. Work on reading. So I educated myself. I taught myself about art. I taught myself about art history. Some of those weekends in New York, when I'm in Central Park, and I would get tired. My hand is literally hurting from drawing so much, and I need to take a break and get some food. I'd go grab a hot dog and walk right on down Fifth Avenue to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Pay and go in, and I thought, my God, I've done it. I've done it. For me, at 19 and 20 years old, I walked into the Metropolitan Museum of Art, pulled out my sketchbook and just sat down in front of Greek statues and said, this is good anatomy. Started to draw. I just sit and study, walk through that place and every piece of artwork that I could find, started collecting every book I could get my hands on artists and so on and so forth. And I would go and meet with with people who worked on comic books. It didn't matter if they were famous yet. It didn't matter if they were super successful yet. I would literally go into a comic shop, look if they had a calendar on the wall of where there was going to be a signing nearby, and I'd be like, oh, there's a signing. Somebody there has work. They have work and I don't. That means they know something I don't. I need to go ask them questions. And I would go ask. I would go ask. There are books that are in the library here at this school right now that were on the very first list of books I was told to get by a guy in comics named Joe Quesada. Probably a name most people don't know, but if you know anything about comics, Joe Quesada eventually became the chief executive officer of Marvel Entertainment. But in 1993, he was nobody, and he met a little nobody kid from Eastern Kentucky who he thought was really weird and spoke funny, but he was nice to me. And when he looked at my portfolio, he's like, hey kid, you need to go get these books. You're on the right track. Go get these. So I got them. And actually, it makes my heart swell to know that those books are sitting in the room right across the hall. That's like, yes, these are scripture. Go to these books, So, yeah. Getting back on track. it became this passion of mine to share what I had figured out through years of self-education, years of being a street artist, I went from being a street artist to being an art director for 2 different media companies in Lexington, Kentucky at one point, and ended up working in animation and film. Good grief. I'm an old school metalhead, so, I got to direct a music video for Judas Priest at one point, and that was just sick. It was absolutely nuts. And all these kinds of things is like, there's a whole pile of things, and I don't want to get into too much of that because it's, I'm really not here to like tout myself. There's a whole lot of experiences that if you had told me at 11, 12, 13 years old, one day you're going to be the kid who does this, I'd have thought you were absolutely off your rocker. But I did it. I did those things. And through those years, it became so clear to me, I'm like, I made my own path. I made my own way. I saw opportunity. I took it. When I couldn't see opportunity, I made an opportunity. I would make an opportunity, make a path. If there wasn't a door being opened, then I would kick it in. And if there wasn't a door at all, well, that wall better watch out because I'm coming through it. It's just how it is. And, there was a part of me that when I was younger used to think, man, it must be awesome to have grown up. I'd see the nice neighborhoods in Connecticut or whatever and think, man, these kids, it must be so nice. They had all this stuff, And after all these years, I'm like, no, I don't envy them one bit. I don't envy them one bit because every single thing I achieve is so much sweeter, so much better. And when you come from something like that, it's powerful. And I wanted to make sure that I was able to give that back to other kids, especially kids from Kentucky, because if you're from Kentucky and you leave Kentucky, you start to find out that being from Kentucky is usually like a big weight hanging around your neck. And I'm like, let's do something about that. So when I met, Miss Emily and Kelly and the folks here, and they asked me if I'd be interested in doing some things, and we talked about some stuff that we'll get into at some point in the future. I made the decision to leave Eastern Kentucky again, which really hurt. Still breaks my heart a little bit. I'm like, all right, I'll go out to the western end of the state because there's kids here that need some stuff too, And there's some things I can learn from them that hopefully one day I'll be able to take back to Eastern Kentucky, back to the hills. So that's kind of my story, or one particular set of stories that pertain to me. Now, as to this, which I know I kind of rambled on for a long time, but actually comic storytelling and culture really are a part of me. So all of that, it's kind of my personal story, but it really is that because, comics as a kid, man, comics were a refuge for me, and man, at 19, getting to go to New York, where's all the DC comics take place at? Oh, they may call it Metropolis or they may call it Gotham, but everybody knows it's just New York. And all the Marvel comics, they didn't hide it. It's just New York. So, for me, it was like I got to go be in the place. I could literally look at buildings that I remembered the artwork from Neil Adams in the comics and go, that's from that comic. That's from that comic, Just amazing, amazing stuff. So, yeah, all of that was just really deeply embedded in me and led to the path that I've been on for 30 years now. 29 going on 30 years. Good Lord, man. So along the way, picked up a number of things about animation and taught myself stuff about computers, and everything was self-taught and just turned into this whole thing. Thinking about comics and how all of that relates back out to everybody else, I guess. There's a phrase, a saying that I heard some old comic book artists toss around when I first started getting in and going to shows and meeting them and hearing them. I think it was Bernie Wrightson was probably the first one. Bernie's a huge influence on me. If you don't know who a guy named Bernie Wrightson is, just look him up. You've got Google. Trust me. Type in Bernie Wrightson, Wrightson. You're going to be astounded. And it's a deep dive. Some of the most beautiful artwork you will ever lay eyes on. And I think it was probably 1994, 1995. Bernie, I met Bernie at a show, and he's looking over my work. And he saw something that I did, and he goes, "Oh, that's Jack." And I was like, "Oh, yeah. I was like, yeah, it's definitely Jack." And he looks at me and goes, "We all live in the house Jack built." It's Jack Kirby. Jack Kirby was a god among men in comics. Jack Kirby created the X-Men, Thor. Arguably, wasn't the actual creator of Captain America, but he took what was created with Captain America and turned it into the character we all know. He created the Avengers, created the Fantastic Four. Just the list goes on and on. All the classic stuff with Marvel that is just everywhere in culture now. Yeah. Stan Lee, yes. Kudos to Stan. Stan did his thing. Stan couldn't have done it without Jack. Jack Kirby was the artist who made that stuff work. And that phrase stuck with me. We all live in the house Jack built. Now, I know Bernie meant that about us as comic book artists, but as I started to study, and at this point, my interest in comics it grew from just a love of them to a study. I started to look at Jack Kirby and his art, and I would look at the way he would stretch a figure, the way he would exaggerate things. Jack Kirby, I won't say he 100% invented the idea of characters breaking outside of panels, but I can't think of who else did it before him. And there were things he would do with layouts on pages. And then if you go back and look at some of the science fiction stories that he illustrated and the way he drew technology, there are things that he came up with before they were ever a thing. There were things he came up with that were borrowed by Star Trek, by Star Wars. It's been borrowed by just about every form of media since then. There are things that he did that changed the way we approach page layouts, things that were adopted by advertising agencies, things that he did with story and pacing and angles and lighting that got adopted by people in film. The list of influences from this one guy from Brooklyn is insane, absolutely nuts. So yeah, in a very real way, we all kind of live in the house Jack built. And that came out of comics. Comic books aren't inherently American art form. And there are great comics from other, like the whole world of manga from Japan. Japan, Korea, Philippines, they're all, the whole Asian world has really exploded with manga since the days of anime and all that kind of stuff. And there's an argument that it's overtaking the American comic book. My son and I have this argument quite often. He's like, Dad, American comics are dead. It's all manga now. And I'm like, maybe for a while. But comics started, comic books. There's been cartooning forever, newspapers, things like that. But the first comic books were put together by a guy, I cannot remember his first name, but he actually, if I'm not mistaken, he's actually related to Jack Nicholson, like by 2 or 3 generations or something. But it was a guy named Colonel Nicholson, who I think it was 1895, started, there were dirt poor in New York, and he would go around to newspapers who were throwing things out. They had leftover stock, and he would go through the leftover stock and literally clip out little cartoon strips and cartoons out of it and paste them up and then resell those as little booklets. And then from that, he got the money to get himself a little printing press. And then he figured out how to turn those into actual printed books and print more of them from what he scavenged from the newspapers. That guy and what he did with that eventually started doing pulp stories that were detective stories, right? Detective comics, DC Comics. And it was out of that came Action Comics and Superman, the first superhero. Straight line. That entire art form, the book, the format, all of that, started by this one guy in Brooklyn. And I love it. To me, it's like one of the greatest, well, it is. For me, it's probably the greatest piece of Americana that's ever been created. It's one of the most culturally relevant things. The relevance of comics, oh my God, you could go on forever about that. And trust me, I seriously can. From the turn of the century when he created comics, moving forward to 1929, Superman was created. Well, you know what was going on around the world in 1929 that people weren't paying attention to yet. A certain nefarious German was having his eyes on Poland. And just a few short years later, the world would be broken out into World War II. World War II hits, and you have a couple of competing companies are making comics, and one of the characters that became an icon was Captain America, who was created to fight Nazis. Captain America. And Captain America became a character, and those books, not just for kids, those books went with soldiers and were sent by families to soldiers to lift their morale. They paid homage to that in the first Captain America movie with some of the USO shows and stuff that they showed. And they kind of brought it back around in a really interesting way. But you had Superman did the same thing. There's Superman and his whole thing. And the guys who created Superman, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, both Jewish. So, yeah, they had a vested interest in that one. And oh my God, being here in Paducah, being right across the river from Metropolis, Illinois. Metropolis is, it's the fictional home of Superman and the Superman Museum over there. If you love comics, just call me up. Say, hey, let's do a day over at the Superman Museum. I'm down. You will. They have original Siegel and Schuster pages over there. Originals that you could stand this close to. It's so powerful. Seeing that stuff. Superman influenced generations. Batman, good grief, Batman. Oh my God. They're one of the most iconic characters ever created. Moving forward, the 1960s hit. Oh my God. The 60s, civil rights movement. Okay? What's comics have to do with civil rights? X-Men. My favorite comics as a kid. Absolute favorite comics as a kid. Because Charles Xavier is Martin Luther King. Magneto was Malcolm X. 100% analogous to them by intent. And so you had, and it's it's not a happenstance that also both of those characters written at that time had backstories that involved fighting Nazis. You have the creators of them, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, were both Jewish. And so they took through the medium of comics all the feelings that they had. Both of them had served in World War II. They took that experience of being veterans from World War II, being Jewish American veterans of World War II, and rolled that into something and said, this is now, let's make these characters. And they imbibe those characters with what they went through and then use them to talk about what everybody else was going through at the time. That's comics. People, a lot of times, I think comics have gotten a little more respect these days. Now they're in movies and all that stuff. I don't know, maybe not, In a sense, we're always a kind of throwaway entertainment. But at the same time, because they were throwaway entertainment, that also meant they had the width and breadth for people to say the wildest things and to challenge the wildest things. I like that. I like that a lot. I liked that as a kid. Really liked that as a kid. I won't deep dive too far into that right now because that's a deep personal subject there for reasons a couple of people in this room probably know. But the relevance of it, of comics and culture, of this throwaway entertainment. And I would offer, too, that plays out into entertainment forms that we have today. A lot of people dismiss video games as just these wastes of time. And yes, there were comics that were a total waste of time. That's fine. There's video games that are a total waste of time. There's movies. There's anything people sit down and do can be a waste of time. Or it can be Professor X and Magneto wrestling with the issues of their day through an allegory of humans versus mutants. It can be things like we see in video games where they pose crazy questions. They wrestle with difficult subjects, and they're free to do it because it's just throwaway entertainment. I personally would say there's no such thing. There's no such thing. If it's a medium through which you can speak, then it's a medium through which you can speak strongly, and that you can wrestle with things, and people will enjoy the work even more when it touches on things, when it struggles with things. Shameless plug, my own book, Apocalypse Girl. That's a goofy name for a comic. Of course it's a goofy name for a comic. This is throwaway entertainment. Of course I gave it a goofy name. The contents of it aren't so goofy. It struggles with things, which is what I think good fiction, good art should do. Want to step away from that for a minute because that's the stuff I started to get super crazy passionate about with comics. I mean, as a culture, as an art form, it's absolutely off the hook. So, yeah, comics are. They used to call Marvel the House of Ideas. And, mild soapbox. Marvel and DC, not real happy with you guys these days, but I would tell folks, go look up, go to a comic shop. Go to a comic shop and tell them, if you've never even looked at a comic, say, hey, you know what? I like this movie or this book or that book. What kind of comics you got that might be interesting? Trust me, they'll have something. They'll point you to something, and it'll be amazing what you find. So I'm going to cut myself right about there and kind of wrap things up with just some ideas about why. Well, I've talked about why I'm here, but where I'm going while I'm here. Like Emily was saying, we've got some things I'm going to be doing with the school here. I'm currently, of course, I have my book. I mentioned Apocalypse Girl. You don't have to. There's a copy of it they can pass around here. But then we have some things going on here in the area with the expansion of my studio and some things that we're doing. Right now, I'm working with a couple of former students from here, helping them with some things, and we shall see what where it all leads. So, Emily, you wanna come up and. I don't know how we're doing on time or whatever,
So we're like super killer on time. I want to ask you just to kind of prod you a little bit
okay.
for some stuff. You've mentioned Batman, you've mentioned Charles Xavier, you've mentioned Superman. Give us some of your thoughts, because I know we've had these conversations before, but give us some of your thoughts on superheroes, yay, nay, what other stories can be told besides a superhero story?
So you can't talk about comics and not talk about superheroes because superheroes have been the lion's share of what comics have been forever. But and now, in terms of what comics do outside of superheroes, I mean, I personally, none of the books that I'm working on are superhero comics. There's also, of course, I'm glad this actually puts me back on a train of thought I was getting to a second ago when I mentioned manga. There's also a thing called bande dessinée. And bande dessinée is French comics, European comics. It's really kind of more about it's not so much French comics as much as it's a reference to the way they treat comics in France. In France, you're not reading comic books, you're into bande dessinée, which is illustrated fiction of a very specific type. So in France, the comic shops or the bande dessinée are these nice places where people go, and it's more like looking at art books. And it's like I don't think they sell a whole lot of what we call floppies, the single individual issues. They sell graphic novels. And there's a whole host of names that I would toss out from that have also, one in particular, oh my Lord, Jean Girard. Jean Girard goes by the pen name Mobius. If you've ever seen the movie Fifth Element, you're watching Jean Girard. It's literally based on his work and his artwork. Alien. James Cameron's Alien, based on Jean Girard. It's Jean Girard meets an artist named H.R. Giger. So, right there. As to the subject of superheroes, I have a love-hate relationship with them. I kind of still love them, in part out of a nostalgia for how big of a thing they were for me as a kid. But I also, if they're done well, they're amazing and they're powerful and they're a great storytelling vehicle that draws on, I'm going to get into some psychology for a second, that draws on like Jungian archetypes, I've heard people refer to Superman. They're like, Superman, oh, he's Ubermensch, going back to Nietzsche. Very, very interesting concepts there where they'll take, these characters who are archetypes. Batman is the archetypal anti-hero. He is the vigilante, the Dark Knight. So, you have these characters. They are larger than life. They're cartoons. They're too big. They're not real. But it's through that exaggeration that they're able to touch these chords of archetype, and there are stories in comics that I would recommend that absolutely do that well. There are stories in comics that play with that. There's some writers in comics who I absolutely adore. Again, if you look up Grant Morrison, I shouldn't say I adore Grant Morrison, love-hate relationship with Grant Morrison. Super weird, super weird, really, really weird guy. But most of the stuff that he works into there examines these archetypes and plays with them and does things. Right now on Netflix, Sandman from Neil Gaiman. Oh my Lord. Sandman is not a superhero comic. Sandman is its own thing. The TV show is great. It touches, it flirts with what Sandman is. If you want to know what Sandman is, you read the books. You read those books. Oh my Lord. There's this interesting thing in them, and I would say this breaks out into part of the value of comics as an art form for me, is that you have a great writer like Neil Gaiman. Neil Gaiman understands prose. He understands history. He understands psychology and all those things, and he works that in, but he also understands the value of the drawn image and leaves this space in the way he writes and collaborates with the artists so that, there'll be things that he might write, that there'll be little things in the background of images that play into phrases and things that are there that just add richness and depth to the words. Think of it like if you're going to a loftier art form, going to see something, at the theater, they might work things into a set that play into what what's going on. If you're going to an opera, they'll have things that, help reinforce the libretto. Gaiman and Sandman, good comics, the writers work with the artists, and the art evokes that. I've heard some people in art who weren't really in comics but respected comics say that that comic books kept illustration alive, and that comic books have been the way that in the modern world we've managed to keep classical art alive. And I know some people in the art world would just be like, at that entire statement. And I'm like, that's fine. I don't care. But, if you look at comics, to draw comics, you have to know composition. You have to know anatomy. You have to know lighting. You have to. You can't get away with it otherwise. You have to be able to do graphic design. You have to be able to do the storytelling, the panel, move the eye across the page. The panels themselves have to have composition and storytelling. They have to have gravitas to them, lighting, drawing skill, actual rendering skill for just the lines on the page. Aside from just the anatomy and the ability to bring images, into an illustrated form. All of that comes together and then works collaboratively with the letterer, with the writer, so on and so forth, to create this thing that's a whole thing. It's kind of magic. That's just the best way to put it. It's kind of magic, and it evokes stories, and it takes us places, and it deals with things. It's powerful. When I was first shopping my book Apocalypse Girl around, I had a sampler that I had a few copies printed up of that I would give away at some shows. And the single most profound thing I've had happen to me in comics, or with my work, that is, on page 10 of my book, the main character's father dies. And there is a panel, a single panel. It's not the whole page. It's not the biggest piece of artwork. It's not the most in-depth piece of artwork but it's the most important piece of artwork I've ever done, because it's just a shot of this much of her face and her eye and her response to, and the only word that's in that panel up to that point, she's talking about what she's thinking has happened to him. And then it says she found him, and then in that panel it's just that eye and the word dead. And it was the hardest panel of a comic I've ever had to draw. Tore me up inside to do it. And at this one show, there was a young lady who had gotten a copy of the sampler. And the sampler just was the first 10 pages. It actually ends right after that. That was the hook. And she got the comic, walks off, goes walking around the show, and about 15 minutes later, she comes walking over to my table with tears in her eyes. And she's like, when does the rest of this come out? I have to have it. And she's like, I lost my father last year. And I looked at her, I was like, that page happened because of me losing my father. That's what that is. So to some people, it's just comic books, it's just throwaway stuff. It's just throwaway entertainment. It's so much more. It's so much more. I could take a character. The main character of Apocalypse Girl is, she's a pretty young, like 19, 20 something girl, right? But I could put my pain, my loss in that character for one panel. And that one panel touched the exact same sense of pain and loss in a person whose name I don't even know, who I will probably never see again. But for that moment, we shared that completely, right through that panel, through that medium. Doesn't get any better than that. Art does not get higher than that. And I'll fight anybody over it. There is no higher art than that. There you go. And superheroes can sometimes do that too.
That almost made me tear up.
There's a mindset that I have about lots of things that I try to teach people is reverse engineer everything. If you want to do a thing, look at it and go, okay, they were there. Well, what was their, if that's the step they took, if they took a step to get there, what was the step right before that? Or what was a step? You might not know their step, but you can look at it and go, well, what was a step to that? Oh, okay, that's a destination. Well, what's a step before that that'll lead to it? And you start to reverse engineer your way back until you eventually go, well, wait a minute, that step's just a step from where I'm at. Once you have that, you have the path to whatever it is you want to do. And then you start taking those steps. You may have to rejig them along the way a little bit. You may find out you were wrong, but that's okay because you're just clarifying what that path is. So for me, I was like, oh, comic books, colors, computer separations. Okay, well, I obviously need a computer. Well, I don't have the money to buy any of these off-the-shelf big ones, but well, it's just parts. So the parts are cheaper than the whole thing, so let's figure that out. So I start asking the questions, figure it out. From there, I start teaching myself these things. And once I got into that, you start reading, and with reading that stuff, for me, it was like introduction to all kinds of stuff, and happened to be right about the time that video games were starting to pop. We had Doom, we had OG Doom and Wolfenstein, and man, I saw that stuff, and I was like, 3D, this is wild. And it was just like, and honestly, it was just for fun. I started teaching myself how to code 3D models. So the first 3D models I ever built, I actually drew them out on graph paper, front, side, and top views, had the graph paper numbered so I'd know the coordinates for everything, and then would pull those coordinates and put them together in a spreadsheet that I would then take into a program through DOS and have compile that into facet data and turn it into a model that I could then use inside 3D Studio DOS. But it was all reverse engineering things. It was all, that's what I want. What's a step to it? Oh, well, that wasn't the right step. Okay, well, what does that tell me? It becomes process of elimination. And you start working your way back and back and back and back and back. And then you go, oh, okay, so these are all the steps I need to do. Well, now that I know the steps, now it's just a matter of doing the work. Once it's a matter of doing the work, you can do anything. You can do anything. You simplify everything that way. Just simplify into steps, little steps, and you can do that. And if it's a matter of breaking into a business, if you want to be an actor, do you have a reel? Have you recorded yourself on camera? Have you acted on a stage somewhere? These are all possible ways to get started. Well, then from there, you're probably going to meet somebody who you could talk to. You ask some questions. You see where the next thing is you can get to. So you just start asking questions, reverse engineering, and building the path. And nobody has to tell you. I mean, sure, somebody can say, oh, you could go here and you could study this with these great thespians and do this, and then you're going to meet this director, and they're going to do this, and you work for this agency and all this. Yeah, there's prescribed paths for things. Like, you're not going to reverse engineer your way into being a doctor. You kind of need to follow the path for that because it's pretty complicated. But there's lots of stuff, and especially in the arts, I would say there isn't anyone who I know of, who I admire, who I have looked up to in the arts, who didn't in some form do what I'm talking about. The arts are the Wild West. And I would say that following the prescribed path in the arts is the direct route to failure. Because everybody else is going to be doing that. You're not going to be set apart. You're not going to, you may end up taking 30 steps you didn't need to take. Or you may end up doing something you didn't need to be doing, or any number of things. So, if somebody has a path for you, definitely look at it, analyze it, analyze it. Take it as a suggestion in the reverse engineering of your own way. But definitely keep that in mind, that you have to look at it, find those steps, and you got to figure out that path for yourself. That's the way to do it. And I don't want to say there's no right way and no wrong way, but there's no correct way. There are unethical ways, and I eschew those deeply. But as long as you are comporting yourself as an ethical human being, and you're doing things in a responsible, trustworthy way, you keep that component in there, which is actually just for the best anyway, because then you develop a great reputation, which just helps fuel everything else. I mean, it all kind of goes together. You be good, trust yourself, and be cagey. Figure out, reverse engineer those steps. And you can do, I'll say you can do anything, doesn't necessarily mean you'll succeed, but it means you'll probably get a whole lot further than a lot of other people do. So, there's a saying that I've heard. I'm not a big sports guy, but I've heard people say, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. When a family member of a friend popped into my apartment after I had dropped out of college, saw artwork all over the place, and says, "What is all this?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm putting together samples to send out because I want to do comic books." She's like, "My husband has a construction business. You're a big guy. Why don't you come work for him up in Connecticut, and then you'll have this opportunity." So the opportunity that was open to me wasn't to go draw comic books. It was to go move about 1.5 tons of rock a day by hand. But that rock put me in proximity to the people I needed to find to be able to do what I wanted to do.
So was that for you moving to,
When
my next question was going to be, how do you find balance and like that leap of faith from leaving like Western or Eastern Kentucky in that sense? Was it more of a leap of faith for you, or was it more of a, you kind of already knew that that was an area where you wanted to be just because you read the comic books and you already were so deeply, you had a connection with it already even though you weren't there?
Looking back, I would call it a leap of faith. At the time, I wouldn't have. Because at the time, I was young and cocky. So, and there was a stupid kind of silly cockiness there that was like, "Oh, well, yeah, I have to do this." Actually, no, I take that back. It wasn't entirely, there was a hint of cockiness there. I'll be honest about that. But it was more a sense of a ride just walked into my door that'll get me to this place. That's the place you do these things. Of course I go. There's no question in that. Of course I go. I literally threw together, I had a box of comic books, my artwork, 3 changes of clothes, and a guitar. And everything else that was in my apartment, left it. Left all of it. Did not care. Did not care. This is what would fit in the space they could allot for me in the back of a truck. And I rode up there actually in the bed of a pickup truck. I rode 13 hours in the bed of a pickup truck. Yeah.
It's been a fun journey.
I mean, I was a country kid. Riding in the back of a pickup truck was no big deal. I was like, all right, I ain't gonna get hot. I got wind, But it was one of those things. It was like, this is what I'm here to do, and like, there's a way that I deal with adversity in life that I think is important. Is that, and not all the time. I mean, sometimes things happen that hit me in the gut, and I have a bad day, and I get upset or whatever. That's just reality. That's just human. But there's a little voice, and I like to think it's from my father, that even the things that seem set against you, the old saying is, that which doesn't kill me only makes me stronger. So if I do a thing and I take an opportunity, I take a chance, and I fail, well, it was a learning experience, and I have to look at that and learn everything I can from it. If I gain some form of success from it, awesome, what's next? But it's, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take, and like I said earlier, it was like, if an opportunity presented, always be watching for the opportunities, because they present themselves at times when you have no idea. You have no idea. None. I mean, I had no idea a year ago I would be living in Western Kentucky helping out, folks with a school. No idea. But, I've done comics. I still do comics. I do animation. I do all these things. I've made it with all that kind of stuff. So what's the next comic book goal for me? Comic books were my goal. What's my goal now? Well, my goal now is to take the experience of all that and bring it to people who need that. They need to know they can do these things. And then they need They need some specifics. There's stuff I'm going to be teaching about actual drawing, which is so much fun. Right now I'm at like the 30,000 foot view and I can riff pretty hard for a while at this, but dude, get me talking about comics, about drawing the comics, about drawing and painting and all that stuff. That's fun. That's all right. Now we're into the good stuff. Now we've got all this prologue out of the way. Get that gone. Let's get into the meat of it, you know. That's fun. But that wouldn't have happened if I hadn't taken an opportunity, which took an opportunity, which opened a door, which turned into another door, turned into working with a guy named Rich, who out of the blue was like, hey man, I'm doing this thing down in Paducah. They got an extra table. You want to come set up? Sure. Now I live here. So once I met them, we started talking, and you know, I think she was like, oh crap, he's serious. She's like, this guy's serious. I'm like, yeah, has a heart attack, boom. And now we've got a little farm, you know, south of the city. Because I was like, okay, cool. And I told her, I'm like, yeah, this is a thing that I want to do. I want to be able to help kids. I want to be able to relay this stuff and help younger people learn how to do these things, learn all these skills, learn the skills, but also learn the philosophy of how you get out there and actually do it. She's like, well, we can do these things here. You know, you can come be a part of this kind of stuff here. And I'm like, okay, I'm in. Let's go. And like 3 months later, we were moved. So, you know, life's too short to sit back and go, well, maybe I should, maybe I shouldn't, I don't know, blah, 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 blah. No, life's too short for that garbage. Jump on it. Jump on it. Absolutely. I mean, I'm almost 50 years old, and I approached that the same way I did going to New York. I was like, oh, I want to build a school one day. Well, I should probably be involved with one first. Oh, look, here's an opportunity that presented itself to do just that. I could have approached coming down to Paducah as, hey, it's a cool comic shop. These are great people. Oh, yeah, talk about some stuff and all that stuff. I could have approached it that way, went back home, went right on, and everything just been normal. It would have been great. Would have been fine. But the way I look at things, we got to talking, and I'm like, this is a step. This is one of those steps. I want that school one day. I want that school that helps people coming up from a place like I came up with who don't know that they can have anything. I want that. Oh, here's a step toward that. Take it. You take it. There's no question. No question. You're going to ask her. My significant other, Miss Janice. There was never a question. Never a question for me. It's like, we're doing this. This is where we go. This is where we're supposed to be. This opportunity is here. And whether it's Providence or whether I'm just crazy enough to jump on something out of the blue, doesn't matter. Call it what you will. There it is. So, you know, and on the other side of that, all kinds of things opened up. It's really wild, actually, how many super cool things opened up just from saying, I'll take that dive. I'll take that bet. Let's go. Let's do this. And come in here. And now, on the other side of that, I literally can see, not super clearly, but I can see some of the steps leading toward that goal. And I know that, you know, barring a tendency towards bum tickers that runs in my family, outside of that, I'm probably going to achieve that goal. That's going to happen. And that's going to leave something that's going to help other people hopefully pick up on the spirit of that. You know, I mean, can you imagine if kids out of the community you come from, kids out of the community I come from, instead of thinking, oh man, it's going to be all this debt, there's going to be all this problem, oh man, I can't do that. You know, what? It's a waste of time. I ain't even bother studying because, you know, what's that going to do? What's this going to do? What's the point? Dude, no. I hadn't touched on this yet, which shocks me because I always say this at some point. As a kid, I got spanked. Oh my God. I got spanked. But there was one thing I could always count on getting a spanking for. If I looked at my father and I said, I can't do that, Dad. I can't draw that. I can't read that. I can't play that. I can't make that hike. I can't do that thing. He would bust my. And he would look at me in his Eastern Kentucky voice, and he'd go, son, can't never could do nothing. Can always gets there first. He's like, you say anything you want. Say anything you want in my house. But that word, can't, strike it from your mouth. Never, never let anybody tell you you can't do anything, and especially not yourself. Don't ever tell yourself you can't, because you can. I mean, if I could come from no indoor plumbing in the middle of honestly one of the most godforsaken places in this entire North America and end up doing the stuff I've done, I don't want excuses. I don't want to hear it. I mean, that's not to be mean about it, not to downplay. I'll listen to anybody in their trials. I'll listen and feel for them. It's like, okay, that's cool. I feel for you. Yeah. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? Don't just talk about it. Don't just cry about it. Strike can't out of your mouth and go do it. That's like the heart of my spiel on everything.
Well, we have a couple questions from Facebook, and I
Oh,
think
Lord.
you may have actually just answered the first one with that. So Brittany says, my 12-year-old has a love for comics since he was young. He's an amazing and skilled artist and has dreams of making his own comics. He's created storylines and characters with backstories and comic series. I can't wait for him to be old enough to attend Paducah's art school. Any tips for him as an aspiring comic artist? His name is William, if you would like to address him directly.
William and William's mother. Find for him, you could probably get it on Amazon, a book called How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way. That book is as pertinent to a kid his age as it is to adults. I know guys who are professionals who still go back and reread that book. And I have reread that book many times over since I was probably about his age. It's a book that there's lots of other books that go much deeper into the stuff, but it's written at a level that a kid his age could probably, even if he can't read all of it, most of it is written with both writing and imagery that explains as a comic how things work, and it might actually help improve reading in some kids too. Like, it's got a neat thing about it like that. But How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way by Stan Lee and John Buscema, absolute bedrock. It touches on everything from how to draw to writing. I mean, it's comprehensive and yet written in such a way. I mean, they wrote it with kids that age in mind. So I would say get that book. That book is gold. It's the gateway.
I put the name of the book in the chat, but I'll link back to it after. So we also have another question. Do you publish your own comics?
No, I don't. I absolutely recommend doing it, but I have been fortunate enough not to have to, thank God. Now, I've been picked up by a couple of different publishers with different projects through the years, and right now I'm with a company, with a publisher called Source Point Press. And by the way, when I say I'm with a company, it's not like having a job with a company. It's more like, it's really similar to being like a musician on a record label. There's lots of similarities. But there is a world, and it's so new and so actually it's one of the things that I still am trying to get a grip on that's kind of come out of the blue and blindsided me a little bit, is the proliferation of crowdfunding and self-publishing. A lot of the best comics out these days are being self-published, and a lot of industry veterans have left the comic book industry to go into self-publishing. And it is the Wild West. The internet is an awful, horrible, terrifying, and beautiful thing all at the same time. So no, I don't self-publish. There's also a strange, this is kind of a little bit of an aside, but there's also a strange overlap now between publishing, having a publisher, and self-publishing. Like Like I'm with SourcePoint Press, and I work on books with SourcePoint Press that have like different creative teams on them. And like I'm working on a book right now called Homestead. Well, Homestead is probably going to get a Kickstarter and do some crowdfunding for the book, even though it has a publisher. Well, it's going to go through a lot of the parts, a lot of the functions of self-publishing, and then the publisher will act almost like a fulfillment company taking care of a lot of stuff. It's very strange. Like honestly, the whole world of publishing anything is, I think about 10 years ago, somebody just took the whole thing, shook it up, threw it out on the table to see how it would land. It's wild. So, yeah, that's actually a more complicated question than it sounds like it should be. So.
Anybody else in the room have a question?
What do you think makes a good origin story?
Hardship. Hardship. What makes a good origin story? Hardship. It's probably one of the reasons why comics resonate so deep with me. I hadn't said this anywhere. I was adopted. So as an orphan kid, as an orphan, what characters you know who were orphans? Superman, Shazam, Batman. You go down the list. But then when you step back and you look at archetypes and mythology, you find heroes throughout mythology quite often are orphans. It's a hardship. It's a really nasty hardship. And I would say that the thing that makes a good origin story a lot of times, I would say every time, the best origin story, it's why we love underdogs. We love underdogs. Because what makes, when we read a story, when we watch a movie, even when we look at a piece of artwork that shows someone transcending hardship, the fact that you see a story, if it's a true story, even better, but if it's fictional, that's okay. If it's fiction and it resonates with you, it still tells you something awful happened to this person, but they overcame it. Well, they're not a special snowflake. I'm not special. I'm not remotely special. There's nothing I have done that anybody else can't do. Nothing. The only difference is whether they say they can or they can't. And in an origin story, that's what that is. That's the person who has, the cards are stacked against them. The system's out to get them. Things are awful. It's terrible. Nothing should go right, and they should be absolutely downtrodden, and they should never be able to do anything. But they do. But they do. Whatever it is that inspires them, drives them, whatever qualities it is in that character that causes them to overcome and to grow and push and achieve and transcend the hardship of their origin, that's what makes a hero. And yeah, in this crazy postmodern world, we can have all kinds of stories that aren't necessarily heroic storytelling, and there's a really cynical school of people who will try to say that that's better somehow. I disagree with them, period. I just flatly disagree with them. I'm done. They can have their opinion, I have mine. I think they're wrong. I think the best stories are heroic stories. I think that's the nature of superheroes. I think that's superheroes, pulp fiction, action movies, mythology, stuff that we have, stories that we have made up to tell each other around campfires since the earliest days of language. Because everybody wants to hear a story that tells them somebody can do what couldn't be done. That's beautiful. Maybe I'm a little idealistic like that. Maybe that's why I'm willing to take chances and do things and step out and stuff, because I believe in that. To me, those kind of stories, those aren't just stories. Those are real. Those are absolutely real. 16-year-old boys storming a beach at Normandy. They weren't supposed to survive. Many of them didn't. They weren't supposed to stop one of the greatest evils the world had ever seen, but they did. Hardship. Hardship makes a hero. And when, you know, I've told my own kids things like this growing up, is like, however bad you think you've got it exactly that good. You've got it exactly that good. However hard it feels, that gives you a chance to be just that damn strong. That's how it is, you know, and it plays out in stories. I think people feel it. I think a lot of people never hear it. They never hear it said. They never, God, don't get me started on it, but these days you don't see a lot of that. You don't see a lot of that spirit of you control your destiny. It's not somebody else. It doesn't matter what they think, what they say, what they do, what they put on. It doesn't matter. Or maybe it does in the sense that whatever they do that's awful, just turn it into what drives you to do more, to be better, to be bigger, to grow, you know? That's what makes a good origin story? Hardship and the drive to overcome it.
So we have another question from Facebook. Well, I'll ask the second one first. Have you ever met Stan Lee?
No. Oh my God. I wish I had. No, I never got to meet Stan. That's yeah. No. Oh God. That's a long list. Man. That's a really long list to get into. I think some of the notables, though, probably the most recent notable, you were almost there for. You were in the same building. Right before COVID hit, SourcePoint sent us down to New Orleans to do a show supporting my book. And one of the other people at that show was Neil Adams, who just recently passed away. And I think I mentioned Neil early on in speaking because as a kid, I read comics. I loved Neil Adams' art as a little kid. He's one of the people, I say, other kids, I'm Batman, I'm Superman, I'm Neil Adams. And when we were in New Orleans, I took a minute away from the table took what started out as a minute away from the table to go over to Neil and say, hey, Mr. Adams, you probably get this all the time, but you're one of the reasons I do what I do. And he's like, oh, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, tell me a little bit about yourself. And I told him the thing about that. And I was like, yeah, when I was a kid, milking cows with books that you'd drawn on my knee. And I also informed him I didn't have indoor plumbing. He's like, oh, so you used an outhouse back in the day, huh? And he's like, kid, you probably wouldn't believe it, but an old timer like me who grew up in New York, we had those there too at one time. And he's like, have a seat. And so this profound childhood hero of mine said, have a seat. And I got to sit and watch him draw for 2 hours as he just talked and shared stories. And man, profound. Just Neal-Adams. Go look the guy up. Insane. It's no longer the #1 selling comic of all time, but for decades, the #1 selling comic of all time was, I think it actually was a benefit for something, but it was Superman versus Muhammad Ali. And it was drawn by Neil Adams. And it's off the hook. It's off the hook. Yeah, just look Neil up. Probably one of the most profound experiences I've had in my career. So, and it was right before COVID. I'm so glad I got to have that.